Well, you've heard the warnings. House prices in parts of the country are red hot. So is consumer debt. And together, the mix could mean big trouble ahead. What should you do? A perfect time for advice from the bottom line. Patty Croft is a former senior economist with a major Canadian bank. Jim Stanford is an economist with the Canadian Auto Workers. Preet Banerjee is a personal finance columnist. And Amanda Lang is the CBC senior business correspondent. Their thoughts in a minute. But first, some basics. What goes up must come down, except it appears in the Canadian house market. Look at these numbers. 20 years ago, the average house price was just over $150,000. 10 years ago, that figure had moved up, but only just. 5 years ago, things started to change more dramatically. And this is today, a continuing upward spiral, especially noticeable in some of the big cities where the numbers are staggering, like Vancouver, Toronto, and Calgary. In fact, prices are so high that in some cities, sellers are considered losers if they only get what they're asking. There are lots of warnings out there about borrowing too much.
Canadian households are becoming overstretched.
This at the same time that money is cheap, and that only helps feed the frenzy. How long can this go on before the whole thing goes kaboom? That's happened elsewhere. Why not here? Or are Canadians somehow immune to a housing crash? Lots of questions. Let's get some answers. All right, recognizing that some parts of the country are pretty stable on house prices, but others, the heavily populated ones, Southern Ontario, around Vancouver and BC, are not. How fragile are those markets?
Well, I think it's pretty fragile, Peter, but I'm not going to use the B word, the bubble word, because I think it scares people. There was a bubble in the U.S. down 35%, bubble in Spain down 50%, but I think nationally we're overvalued by about 10 to 15%. So that's not a bubble. I'd use the analogy of an overinflated bike tire. We need to let a little air out, but it's not going to pop. But I've studied bubbles for at least 30 years, Peter. And a couple of rules of thumb. One is that they're always obvious with 20/20 hindsight. Once it popped, everyone says, oh, that was clearly a bubble. But the other factor is bubbles can go on for a lot longer than you expect. So don't be surprised if a year from now we're still talking about this so-called bubble in Canadian housing.
So you're not predicting when it might burst?
No.
All right. Jim, will you?
I'll use the B word. I think bubble is absolutely the apt description of what's happening in some of those regional markets, Toronto and Vancouver, where we're particularly concerned. People are clearly buying real estate not for its real value, not to live in, but as a speculative investment, assuming the price is going to get higher and higher, and that always ends in tears. A new factor that I think has added some extra risk into the equation, the federal government trying to kind of rein in this whole party has capped the role of CMHC, our public mortgage insurance system, which has played a very stabilizing role. It's helped us through the whole crisis. Now they've capped it, which I'm not sure is the right thing to do. That's pushing a lot of business into sort of riskier, private, uninsured mortgages, sort of the subprime type of thing that we saw in America. That could actually cause many problems down the road as well.
Preet, where are you on the fragility question?
Well, I think we're definitely in bubble territory, and the reason for that is cheap credit. So in the last 20 years, we've seen a period of falling interest rates. The amortizations of mortgages have been allowed to expand, and down payments have allowed to be decreased. So what that means is people can borrow more money, and if you can borrow more money, you can spend more money. So if we take a look at that versus income growth, they're totally out of whack.
Amanda.
You know, I would say that there is certainly evidence of overheated markets, and you know, to Patty's point, the market tends to correct about 20% from peak to trough. So, you know, are we there? I don't know. I will tell you something that's kind of qualitative, and that is that it feels to me like it did in 2007 when people talked about the U.S. market. A lot of the commentary is, don't worry, it's not a bubble. It's just, I'm getting these kind of weird deja vus about back then in the U.S. housing market.
But I think one key difference, though, Amanda, is right now we are talking about it. So it's not just that cocktail party chatter. The government, the Bank of Canada, the banking regulators are all talking about this, recognizing it is an issue.
But a lot of
and
market participants are still willing to tell people, don't worry, this time it's different.